I'm going to start again and give you an overview of our approach to anthropological research during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And here, this is research that was conducted in and around a number of clinical trials, notably the Jiki Favipiravir trial, which was supported by Horizon 2020, and the current PREVAC trial, which is a trial looking at two vaccine products versus placebo, which is funded by NIH and INSERM. So I was going to take us, I think this is quite a different approach than the previous presentation, because I want to talk more about how clinical trials in outbreak settings can further anthropological knowledge rather than the other way around. I'm doing this because I think this audience understands what we can contribute as anthropologists to the implementation and uptake of clinical trials, and as a result, I wanted to really stress that for us as anthropologists, epidemics offer unique opportunities for basic social science research, analogous to the way perhaps immunologists or virologists would see an epidemic as an opportunity for basic biological science research. This is because crises reveal the underlying way. Crises can be used to illuminate the way in which social order is maintained and constituted. Crises meaning epidemics, war, etc. And more classically, we've always looked, we've been interested in these critical moments in everyday life, such as birth and death and so on and so forth. So our basic focus is on understanding the contemporary ways in which sociality is constituted. So I wanted to give you, therefore, a few basic tenets of our approach here, which is that when we were working with these trials, we were as interested in understanding social factors that could be relevant and therefore that needed to be addressed to ensure successful trials. But to do that, we had to study as much the target communities, if you will, as the interveners or the trial infrastructure itself. One thing that I think is important to mention here is that there's often this term community is often invoked in a very kind of uncritical or superficial way, and what we know now from quite an extensive body of anthropological research is that in a way there's no such thing as a community, right? There are several publics that are constituted through multiple publics that are constituted through our interventions. So it's hard to know the community with it. The way we approach and learn about communities in a way constitutes them as well. So it's a bit like in physics, when you observe something, you change it at the same time. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button here. Here we go. So one of the challenges that we have, and this image hopefully will give you an idea of this, is that social reality is messy and can't be fixated. So we are interested in studying something of which we are a part, and the studying of which changes. So this requires us to be reflexive, to be aware of how the way in which we study things actually produces change. And the use of theory here is important, because for us, different theories are different lenses that we use and we change to get to focus in or out on social realities. And I can explain that more in the Q&A, but I just wanted to stress that theories are an important part of how we work. We have to develop theories about, we use theories to define what it is we want to look at, but when as we collect data, we're constantly developing and testing new theories to see whether they actually explain better the phenomena that we're observing. And this can be called concept work. Now, I'm going to go into more specific detail here to explain our approach to supporting and working in and through these two trials that I have mentioned previously. So the way we did this is, first of all, we identified and trained a small cohort of local sociologists, of young people who had sociology degrees, and you'll see that the person, Gamay and Germain, the person on the second and third from the left, are currently, with support from the Horizon 2020 project, completing their master's degrees in Dakar. So we trained young local people as field researchers, and this took an enormous amount of time, because we really had to make sure that they understood and were able to use different theories that would allow them to do ethnography in the field. And once they had been trained, and we trained them interactively with, I spent about 6 weeks. They were going back and forth to different field sites, doing observations, feeding back. We were doing sort of a hands-on interactive training, which I don't have time to go into great detail about. And once we had started this initial round of training, which involved return visits to, in this case, the field was different neighborhoods in Conakry, the group, the different field workers were dispatched to different parts of the country that were relevant to the outbreak. We also had, of course, PhD students. We had 3 PhD students from Senegalese PhD students, and a number of postdocs from Burkina Faso and France, who were also assisting and supervising these younger people as they were doing fieldwork. Now, initially, we started doing fieldwork in Ebola treatment units. The basic reason for that was that the first trial, for the Piravir trial, was being conducted in Ebola treatment units. And this enabled us, importantly, very usefully for subsequent work, to build trust with family members families of individuals who were hospitalized or admitted to the Ebola treatment units. And this was actually very, very, not that unexpected, but it has turned out to be crucial to the work we've been doing subsequently, because of the kind of depth and strength of the trust. In many, every treatment unit was different, but in some of these treatment units, anthropologists were actually participating in care, and certainly they were doing a lot of explaining about what was going on and reassuring of family members. Now that the epidemic has subsided, those links remain, and we remain in touch with these individuals in different communities. And of course, we also conducted field work in what I would call everyday life in affected communities. And in communities in general. And what we were trying to do there was really to map social relations using a variety of empirical tools to understand sort of power structures, patterns of sociability, where people went, what they did, what was important, who were the people they trusted, and so on and so forth. So this mapping exercise was one that was done through being in those communities and just talking to people and living with them, essentially. You can see here the importance of having local research assistants, as although I spent time in a slum of Conakry, I was obviously not African, so that sort of biases the way people look at you. And then what we did is we had we regularly met to discuss our findings and our experiences and do some of this concept work. Now, in terms of actual results, I think there's a number of findings that have turned out to be quite useful. The first one is the gap between a really quite significant gap between the kind of rhetoric of community and engagement and participation, which was being used by a range of actors in the Ebola response, and a gap between the rhetoric and the practice and what was actually really going on in different communities. To put it very succinctly, the response was largely used a strategy which involved working through community leaders. These community leaders were thought to be trusted and were believed to be important to awareness raising, recruiting for trials, and so on and so forth. In fact, these community leaders had become powerful because they had been identified through earlier interventions, and there was a sort of blending together of administrative authority and community leadership. In other words, the people who were representatives of women's groups or of the village elders and so on were people who were also the relay, were the people through which governmental power was exercised. So when the aid started to arrive with the epidemic, this caused a lot of frustration because these were sort of the elite who were seen to be profiting from the epidemic because they were receiving the aid. So we have this traditional form of authority which was being used as a conduit for aid and for information. But what we also saw was the emergence of organic and of a younger generation that saw in the epidemic an opportunity to organize and a responsibility to protect their communities. These two photographs come out of an incident with which we were involved, where a group of these traditional elder figures were, prior to the visit of the Minister of Health, were dispatched to a village to prepare them for the visit of the minister and instruct them on how to show they were being ready for Ebola. Unbeknownst to them, the village had itself, the young people in the village had organized a self-protection league or association who, when they saw these trucks coming, thought they were coming to spread Ebola and attacked the village elders. Sorry, this is a long story, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of situations we were involved in. The word got back to the prefecture, the police were sent, and all the young people from the village were arrested and thrown in prison. And this became a very tense standoff. And we actually forced our part. We were involved in this area, and on the left, who is speaking to the young people who've been arrested. And we were able to convince the governmental authorities that the young people should be allowed to be let go if they ask for forgiveness, which is what you're seeing on the right. So this is a kind of, so this gap between what we would call traditional and charismatic forms of authority in communities was something that was very important to us, and which we are now using in developing community engagement with the different the vaccine trials I've mentioned before. To finish up quickly, another thing that we were able to that we discovered that we did not suspect is that many of the villages in which the Ebola epidemic initially struck had been sites of previous sleeping sickness epidemics in the 1930s and 1940s, and had been the subject of forcible treatment with preventative treatment with a drug called, in this slide you see it's called Lamidine, but its current name is pentamidine. So memories run long, and that was part of the suspicion that was feeding efforts to respond to the epidemic. So we were really confronted here with something that term you may have, some of you may be familiar with, which is hysteresis, with the fact that at times even very distant historical events continue to affect the present, even though those events have passed, are no longer active in the present. So you have to unpack and disarm these kind of historical memories and practices that are conditioning the response to the current epidemic. And I'll just end up by saying, in terms of findings, that of course, society moves slowly. Things change slowly. Some things change quickly, some slowly. And of course, it is far too early to judge the long-term effects of the epidemic. But this is something we're very interested in, and I could give examples, but we're continuing our contacts, as I mentioned, with families who were affected by Ebola, by people who worked in the Ebola treatment units. And I think it will take at least 3 or 4 more years before we get a sense of how this epidemic has been inscribed in collective memory, and how it will impact the way future clinical trials are perceived in this part of the world. And I'll stop there.